But for now, let's get started with our main kind of discussion for the day, and I've put this together to be very much a real discussion amongst peers. I've certainly laid the foundation to help navigate this discussion, but I'm really looking to everyone to help contribute. And one of the things that you'll find as part of today's session as well is that this checklist is not the be all end all of checklists. It is a living document. I would very much value your input, feedback, and the whole community would value your input and feedback as we work to enhance, improve this over time. If there's a technique or a step that you take in your own research that you don't see represented here that you think would really benefit others to think about and include, let's talk about that and add it in. But let's start off with just a definition of what are we talking about when we're talking about the competitive landscape. And I'm not talking about just the analysis. The analysis is the process where we get to an understanding. But the competitive landscape, at least in my view and my experience, comes down to a few converging concepts. And I'm really curious, for some of those who are here in the room, how would you define a competitive landscape in your business? What is a competitive landscape to you? Anybody want to jump in before I dilute the conversation with my own perspective?
Well, I think, a competitive landscape is understanding really the market, but looking at it from the lens of what are you bringing to the market and what are your differentiators as compared to other players that are out there that may have similar capabilities.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Anybody want to add anything to that?
Sure.
I think one thing to add there is you need to really consider what the barriers to entry for that market would be too.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody jump into it if they have enough money, or is it more to it than that?
Yep.
I think competitive landscape is also just getting there. It's the map, right? It's figuring out what is out there, both of not just from products that compete with you, but also adjacent to you that work in synergy with other products. And from a perspective also potential customers, because what you're really looking at is your customers can sometimes be your competitors if they choose not to use your product.
That's true. That's true. One of my favorite examples exactly of that even is we taught here quite a bit. You met Toli at the AI forum. You met Jeff Durnovich over at Lease Query, and they do lease accounting software to help with some regulatory issues. And their number one competitor is customers just manually tracking all of their lease data, whether they're using Excel or Google Sheets or some document management solution. Their competitor is no product. That's their number one competitor. So when I think about the competitive landscape, I think of it as a convergence of three things. And I think all three of these things have been mentioned here. One is the competitive landscape. A huge part of that is what is the target market and the opportunity space? How are we defining the place that we play, the area, the geography, the map that we play on in the first place? Another piece is, and this was where you were talking about barriers to entry and things like that, Stephen, is what are the market pressures and the influences that are causing changes and evolution in this market to begin with? And finally, who are the players and how are they positioning themselves and where are they situated in the market on that landscape map? So I think that kind of captures how I think about the components of what a competitive landscape actually is and defined. If I think about what you were saying, Marcia and Stephen and Toli, does that cover kind of the perspective that you share? Is there something missing here that you would add?
Well, something that came to my mind that I would just throw out there. I mean, this would fall into that somewhere. are there switching costs involved with your product and your competitor's product that people have to go through to get to yours? That's doesn't really answer your question. I'm just throwing it out there because it was on my mind.
Yep. And I think as we get into the landscape analysis, you'll see that that's definitely a piece that we want to emerge with. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about, though, before we get into the actual checklist is the notion of who owns the perspective on the competitive landscape. And maybe you've got a team or a department or somebody in your organization that is responsible for building this knowledge within your organization. Maybe it happens in a haphazard kind of a way. Maybe, sales has a perspective and marketing has a perspective, support has a perspective, customers have a perspective, and you're just kind of aggregating those things on a demand basis. So why would you say it's important for we as product leaders and product managers and product professionals to have our own perspective on a competitive landscape versus relying on someone else's?
I think from a product perspective, one of the things I was going to ask in the earlier slide is getting position on the product and the solutions it's solving and then getting into the features and parts of the portfolio that make up that product.
Yes.
Jason, I'm going to go back to something that I heard Greg Katikia say yesterday on a webinar about your job as a product manager is to drive the success and health of your product, and that you're going to persuade and manage and lead people to follow you and follow the direction that you're setting. And you have to basically filter through that information you're getting from all those different perspectives to give everybody a sense of what that landscape looks like. Everybody's going to come to the table with a different perspective, a different lens: sales, marketing, your leadership team, your customer success people, UX, whomever. And you've got to consolidate all that information together and help them to make sense of it and see what that landscape truly looks like for your product to be differentiated and to lead in the space that you're in.
Yep. Hey, Jason.
Yep, that is, yes. Yes, Hector.
This is part of your design of your product strategy. Make sure it's relevant based on the context of what's happening in the market, in the industries where you operate or that you're selling into. And it should be part of the first step is understanding the current landscape before you even begin your next version of your product roadmap. In areas where I've been, we do this at least once, maybe twice a year. And then we begin this process and then analyze it together and put together all the stakeholders that would have opinions as to what should be on our roadmap, and start creating roadmaps for our entire portfolio, but also product by product. And it also includes technology roadmaps of things that need to be considered to be incorporated across our portfolio based on trends and opportunities of where adoption is going in the near future. And what I find is that for the lack of doing that, if you try to do it alone, you're always going to miss something because you don't have that diversity of perspectives and thinking that you need to be able to decide of all these things that are happening out in the market, especially when there's a large number of players, what is most important to do, and decide and choosing what not to do because it's really not that urgent or important, and only focus on the top 1 or 3 things that you can do and make sure you execute well on those few things that give you the most impact.
I think that's really well said. Faith also said in the chat that their marketers think they own it, but they don't really see that the info they need to market competitively isn't the same as the info I need for my product. And that gets to a little bit of the root of one of the things that you're talking about, Hector. It comes back, it's been said repeatedly, and I love this phrase, that product management is the conscience of the organization, of the company. And the reason that we say that is our role in the product space is to look across the entire landscape and aggregate multiple perspectives and synthesize them into actionable direction in the product portfolio. And so understanding that a lot of other teams in the organization can do a lot of the groundwork. You're going to gather data and information and perspectives from lots of groups with it throughout your organization and stakeholders. But your job is to see across the entire landscape and bring all that together. Stephen, I didn't mean to keep going there. You want to jump back in here real quick?
Sure. Well, thank you. I was going to just throw out there, and along with the lines with Ramesh said there, that you need to have your own position on the perspective on the landscape. I've not heard it mentioned here, so I just wanted to say that as I recall it, one of the classic analyses for doing this is the Porter's Five Forces analysis to understand all the competitive pressures within the industry. If you can really think that out, that definitely gives you a good basis for starting.
Yep, there are absolutely a lot of, there are several frameworks that help go through that, and Porter's Five Forces is a great one. And especially once you've gathered the information, you're starting to look at, at synthesizing all of that information into kind of an actionable readout and perspective and plan. But even getting started with that, there are kind of some process things to do. And I would like to, and I do want to kind of call out something that Ramesh said here in the chat is you should have your own perspective on the competitive landscape so that you can come up with your unique value proposition in a crowded market and validate the perspective of others as well. And I just realized I'm still showing the art of markets. I was showing the wrong thing there. So that you can not only come up with your own unique value proposition, but also so that you can validate the value proposition that your products are presenting right now and ensure that they are relevant in the market and continue to be relevant in the market. So with that, let's introduce the checklist. And I suspect many of you have already kind of gone over and downloaded a copy of that. But let's kind of talk through it a little bit for a few minutes and dig into the steps for building out a competitive landscape. And we've broken this into kind of 6 major sections, phases. The first is understanding the industry landscape, then defining your market or your market segment, depending on where you sit in an organization. Identifying and categorizing your competitors. So once you've defined the market, who are the players in the market? And then analyzing their offerings and capabilities is number 4. 5, the next step is to gauge their marketing and sales strategies. And then lastly, synthesizing all of that and visualizing that information into useful readouts, useful playbooks, useful documentation that you can use. So let's get started with understanding the industry landscape. And the first thing, of course, is to define exactly what your industry is. How are you going to define that? And that goes a little bit to what Toli was saying earlier, is building a real perspective on what the industry is, where it exists. Sometimes that's geographically, but what are the industry trends and the forces and the pressures that are causing shifts in behavior, the technological advancements that are causing shifts in what's possible in the market. Who are the major industry players? This isn't even necessarily getting into pure competitors. For example, in marketing technology, you can look at industry players that are not your competitor, but are having an impact on your product utilization. I've got a long marketing technology background, so I tend to lean on that for some real examples. And for years and years and years, whether you were using Salesforce.com or not, as a marketing technology company, whether you were partnering with Salesforce.com or not, they were having a massive impact on your market as a whole. So you had to be aware of what they were doing, where they were. So understanding the industry players, how they influence in general, and what their market share looks like is kind of the third step in here. So we've defined our industry, and then we start doing some research and studying industry trends so that we can define that further, identifying who the industry players are, and some of these are going to be competitors. One of the things that people don't immediately go look at, and this goes back to some of the forces there, is what are the laws, regulations, and standards that are impacting the industry? I've been talking to a lot of companies that are really working in green technology space, and a lot of what they're looking at right now is they're understanding the market landscape and the industry landscape for their own purposes. Is where are there regulations? Where are there not regulations? And what are we predicting is going to happen from a regulatory perspective that we need to be in a position to pivot with in different markets? So building that understanding just as part of your industry understanding is a huge part of the role. Matt, I'm certain that you have to think about industry regulations and standards quite a bit as well in your role.
They just came out with a new one in April, so.
What's that?
I said it's like keeping up. They just came out with a new one in April that actually opens up a whole big market.
Yep. And having the framework to keep tabs on that is part of understanding your industry landscape. Before we even get into competitors, understanding those forces is critically important because that gives you another lens to find competitors and adjacencies that'll be important for your landscape. And then finally, what are some of the common challenges that are faced within your industry in the first place, and making sure that you're keeping up with why your company is relevant in an industry to begin with. What are the challenges that are relevant and impacting you? And that's kind of setting your foundation. It's largely a thought exercise. If you've been in your role for very much time at all, you're already building a picture of this. But what you may not have done is actually documented this and built out your list of knowns and unknowns to go and research further and fill in the gaps. And this is an ongoing activity, but take a few minutes, take a half a day to do some writing. The power of writing is incredible. Sit down and start defining these things in your own words, looking for the support and filling in the gaps where you don't have them. When you're thinking about understanding the industry landscape as a whole, is there anything that, and I would encourage everybody just through the course of this discussion today, throw in the chat if there's something that you want to add, throw your hand up, jump in and say, what's something else that I do is. I'd love to hear those things, and we'll continue to iterate on this.
So, Jason, I wanted to contribute on the industry landscape.
Please.
I think it's good to do Porter's 5 forces model to understand the entire 360 view of what's going on in your industry, but also do a pestle analysis. So look at any legal stuff, but also environmental, which is now been surging more and more. Companies that have a stated purpose as to what their intent is as far as reducing their carbon footprint are, actually making that, even though they may not be in that circular economy industry, but they're looking at tracking and making sure that they reduce their carbon footprint over time.
And that is a specific industry evolution that is impacting a lot of companies right now.
It's a trend that I think it's going to be long term. I mean, it started this century, and it's going to continue moving forward, regardless of whether that's anything that has to do with your market and your product portfolio.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Interesting call out. Thank you. Anything else that anyone would add here? Change or challenge? All right. So when it comes to defining the market, so we've built an understanding, and this is foundational work in the first step. Now we're actually starting to put some definitions on things and making note of who exactly your potential customers are. You get a lot of that sense from who your current customers are if you're an established organization, but you also, when you're thinking strategically and you're looking at this market landscape, you're looking at that overall industry landscape and saying, well, actually, who are Are there customers that we're not addressing that we ought to be? Who are our potential customers? And tell us about them. How do they buy? Where do we find them? What do they think about? What are the driving forces that they're concerned with? And building that as part of your market definition. Obviously, estimating the size of the market is really important, especially for validating as you're thinking strategically and the types of investments that you're willing to make. Are there customers out there? How big is the market? And that's going to impact how you're going to go to market and how you're going to address that market. What's the revenue potential? And one of the things I wanted to actually share with you also is it's going to be next week. Yes, next week we've got Dave Hawkey from, he is Vice President of Product at Hearsay Systems, and he's got a fantastic approach for product managers and product professionals to build their own perspective on industry sizing as well. And he's going to come share that with us as well next week and talk through how he does industry sizing and market sizing work with publicly available information, especially when analyst data isn't necessarily available, and the formulas that he uses to build some evidence-based perspectives and values on a marketplace, especially as you're moving in an emerging market or a weakly defined market. Join us next week at 11:30 for that session. We'll talk more about that at the end of today's session. Understand the geographical scope. Where does the market exist? Is this purely a Western market? Is it a global market? Is it a U.S. market? Is it a Canadian or a Latin American market? Understanding those factors is part of that market definition. And what is causing the market to exist as a viable financial market? What are the unmet needs, or what are the gaps, or what are the opportunities for improvement? And building a clear definition of that. And finally, and certainly not least, is there growth? Do we expect growth? And that's an important part of your market definition as well, is building a forecast of the potential growth based on what you can discover through existing analyst reports or through your own observations and research as to growth and investment trends and historical patterns as well. Is there anything else that should go into a market definition that you don't see here that you would expand upon?
I have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, when you're referring to unmet needs or gaps in the market, you are specifically referring to unserved and underserved segments, right?
That's a part of it. There's also so not just segments, but also what are as you're defining that market, what are the needs that define that segment in the first place? What do they not have access to that cause them to exist as a market?
Okay.
So it's a both and.
When it comes to sizing market, I've also seen people put a more realistic figure or estimate on that, because there has been a tendency before where I've seen those market sizes inflated. Kind of goes back to what I think Tully was saying at the beginning, like how much of our own BS do we believe? Are we really going to capture all of this, or is it more like 30%? That's our target. Or is our first target like 15 to 20% of it, and then we grow up from there?
Yeah, so
I've just seen some wild numbers thrown out where I'm like scratching my head. Oh, this new product is really going to get this. Yeah, sure. Okay.
Yeah, this is a $400 trillion market, serving 3 countries in Eastern Europe.
We don't even speak their language. Better get started on that.
Yep.
So I wanted to point out that doing number one, most people think that it's enough to just find third-party market reports and get, to specific addressable market and total addressable market, and maybe has a little bit of demographics, but psychographic behavior and buy behavior, and even customer experience, the expected customer experience for each persona that is a buyer and a user of your platform. That requires a lot of additional homework that is not on any third-party market report. And I think that that's where I see a lot of companies that just rely on secondary market research, and they think that they can just derive all the things that need to be further explored through your own market research. And most organizations, in my experience, do not do that well. You're not going to get enough information by doing only surveys. You got to do a lot more collection of customer research in order to derive psychographics and buying behavior.
Yep, you're absolutely right, and part of what you said there goes back to what Matt and Tolly were saying as well. Is you go out and you rely on that external research, and it is often inflated, inaccurate, or doesn't take in the nuances of the market that you're strategically actually serving. You can look at the total addressable market for accounting software is very different than the total addressable market for lease accounting software. And I love going back to the lease query example because prior to the creation of lease query and another competitor or two, there was not a defined market for that space. And as you're being smart as a product leader, you're thinking about how can I address different niches within the market so that I can really exceptionally serve different customers and serve different businesses exceptionally well. So having the tool set to create my own market perspective allows me to focus in more clearly on the market that we really need to be serving. And something that you mentioned that was really interesting there, Hector, as well, is you're thinking about the psychographics. So often we think about psychographics specifically in a context of consumer product management. We don't think about it we don't talk about it nearly as much in a B2B product management. It is still really important to understand the psychographic component that influences your users as well as your buyers. It's actually more complex and more important to understand that, I would submit, in B2B than it is in B2C, but B2C is where we talk about it all the time.
Yep, and I think that's a fallacy. The example that I gave of this company that I'm actually right now in the process of interviewing for, I think this is their number one problem. The lack of knowledge and the lack of understanding of psychographic behavior when they're purely a B2B company.
Yep.
Yeah, I wanted to add that I think, one of the things that you said is if you're in a new market or an emerging market, the lack of data is pretty prevalent. And that's really where that test and learn comes into play in terms of collecting your own information about that market. How do you go about doing that? Is really kind of putting something out there potentially where you are in a test and learn to really understand, where something's going to have impact or not.
That's a really good point too, Marcia. Thank you. I also saw here in the chat, Rob asked a question when we're talking about the market sizing. He asked, how saturated is the total addressable market? And that's an important factor as well. As you may have a market, but part of understanding that market and that landscape and that competitive landscape that we end up with is not only does the market exist, what does it look like, but how well is it already being served? And I think we're going to get into that in the next section a little bit as well. As we start to really identify and categorize those competitors. And this is pretty intuitive once you've done your foundational work. And there are a couple of different lenses to look at your competitors through. And the first is, who are the companies that are targeting the same money and offering similar solutions? That's part one. But the more advanced thinking is part two, is thinking about different solutions targeting the same customers' needs or opportunities or jobs to be done. We're reading the Jobs to be Done book right now in the book club. But when you're defining your competitors, this goes back to one of the conversations we were having earlier in the session today, is so often the competitor may not be a product that people are buying. It could be a behavior that people are relying on in order to solve their problem, to meet their opportunity, to meet their need. So really understanding the opportunity space that you're serving as part of that market definition, and identifying other ways that people are meeting those needs, even if they're not necessarily something you would consider a direct competitor, is part of understanding what that real competitive landscape starts to look like. And they may not even be in the same sector. They could be perceived as alternatives. Microsoft Excel is the number one example that I hear all the time as our number one competitor is Excel. They are not in the marketing technology business. They are not in the lease accounting business. They are not in the accounting business. They're spreadsheet. They're for data manipulation, data management, and calculation. But they are an alternative to so many solutions out there. What else do you do to identify and categorize your competitor? How do you find your competitors?
So I think the biggest blind spot also when I see looking at competitors, and I agree with what your point, most people don't look at disruptors, and disruptors typically are not direct competitors, right? They're the ones that are threat of substitutes. When you look at the Porter's 5 forces model, they're always going to be adjacent or someone that is too small to be considered a competitor if you're a mid-market or larger company. But the problem is, substitution, it's not just the size of your competition, it's the number of small competitors and the flow of those disruptors that end up disrupting much larger companies. And for the most part, these companies for a long time don't consider the volume of these smaller players to be a threat to what they're doing, when in fact, that's what happens over and over across industries. So I think that tracking threat of substitutes as part of your competitor and being aware of how they're presenting themselves, how they're positioning themselves, and looking at what is the style and who they are appealing to, and make sure that your product, you don't have to necessarily change your product, it's the way you present it and the style that in the manner that you present it that really matters to actually start delaying the impact of disruption in your space.
Hey, Hector?
Yeah, and I think, yeah.
I just want to throw in there, this is where what I mentioned before about switching costs comes into play too.
Yeah, Hector, I've seen this firsthand where the disruptors and the multitude of different companies that are competing can actually chop up the market so much that and a company who relies on a larger share of the pie, it just becomes eroded to the point where that established company can no longer there's challenge to sustain itself and its business, its line of business, because all those different competitors are taking this piece and that piece of the pie.
Yeah.
One of the things that's also important is, we talked about customer discovery quite a bit, and I feel like a lot of people, when they do customer discovery, too focused on would you be interested in this product versus the element of what else have you seen out there? What are you using? What do you know? What are people in the industry using? What would you use if you had the option? Because a lot of the time, companies may have limited budgets for certain things, and that'll also allow you to learn more about them. But your customer can give you some of the best competitive analysis you'll ever have.
That's a really good point as well, Toli. So I really like the lean in on understanding disruptors as part of that competitors. What are of course that's really challenging. Also, that's a really challenging factor. Identifying those disruptors. I feel like totally you're about to disrupt a lot of people, but you're invisible still to a lot of people as well. So identifying those disruptors and those potential pressures is exceedingly hard to do. How do you do that? And that gets to, I think, Manesh, that gets to your question that you asked in the chat. How does job to be done impact your competitive analysis? And it comes down to understanding the real driving forces in the market and understanding what those opportunities and jobs to be done are. And I don't think we even necessarily put a specific step up in the market definition. And I think we should, as we were defining the industry landscape, is really understanding the jobs that are trying to be solved in the industry and continuing to hone in on those. Because once you are understanding what it is, what the outcomes are that your market is really chasing, is really looking for, then it becomes easier to identify early players or early stage players who have a need to solve those same opportunities, or have the ability to help solve those same opportunities. And getting into the competitor offering, as you're actually starting to look at their offerings, you start to understand the how. What is it that they're actually doing? What are the features, benefits? What are the differentiators? How are each of your competitors winning against you? And one of the things that we often have a tendency to do is say, well, we know our product is better, just not everybody sees it. Maybe we don't communicate it well. We tell ourselves this story that we know that we're actually the superior product, and we know what our pains are, and we know what we need to fix. But why can't the market actually see why we're winning, why we should be winning? But really understanding your enemy, your opponent, your antagonist, and respecting their differentiators and why their customers choose them over you, and whether some of those customers ought to choose them, and because they're not actually the customers that you want to chase. Are those differentiators healthy in that they let you focus on the customers that you're best suited and best intended to serve, or are they actually competitive pressures? Understanding that distinction becomes really important. And beyond just the product itself, understanding the nature of those competitive businesses, digging into how do they work, how do they go to market, how do they do business, how do they align their products to their services overall, and does that give them operational strengths? Does it give them weaknesses? Capturing that information, all of this is going to go into a SWOT analysis ultimately, but this is where you're gathering that perspective and gathering that information. And absolutely critical to do a deep dive on your customers and intentionally understand how they are positioning themselves. What is the message they're delivering to the market about who we are, why we exist, what we're doing? How do each of your competitors want the world to perceive their brand? And what are the opportunities for disruption comes into there as well.
So, Jason, I wanted to add something. I mean, larger companies like Google and Meta and Microsoft, they have teams that do this, and that's all they do, right? They're looking at this, all these threats of disruptors and substitutes, and they focus on studying them. And before they get too big, once they start winning in the market because they're tracking demand for their whatever they're selling, they will acquire them, right? That's the way the large enterprises work all the time. And if you look, 2020 post COVID-19, we saw a surge in acquisitions of AI startups, and then voila, 3 years later, 2023, you see this huge entry of AI products that are either owned by Google, Microsoft. They all have a stake on one of these companies, including OpenAI, which produces ChatGPT, because they did this, and as opposed to stopping them or trying to compete with them, they simply owned a piece of those companies very early on. So it's another way of looking that is outside of product, saying if we believe this product has a future, we need to make sure that we invest in those companies and get behind them, because at some point, as they win, we want to win as well. And it's not about product, it's about delivering more value to your current customers and your future customers.
But you want to, and Rob says, +1 Hector. How many companies have the business models where the last line is sell for dollar to big company? Step 1, invent product. Step 2, question mark. Step 3, profit.
Yep. And most companies have this dilemma, right? They become, like the founder's dilemma or the inventor's dilemma. They think they can just continue operating forever without changing anything once they get to profitability. That's not right. There's always going to be somebody who invents a better or different mousetrap, and people are going to migrate to that, even if it's a short-term migration towards that because it's something new. It actually stalls your growth rate eventually when you have a flood of these substitutes that are entering the market. And you can't stop that. What you need to do is be smart enough and pick the right ones. And as they win, you win. And it's about lateral thinking in the way that you maintain your market share leadership.
Great. Thank you. And so let's move on. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left here. So let's go on to the last couple of sections. And in the last section, we looked at their positioning, but now we're going to actually talk about their marketing and sales strategies. And this is, and we've kind of circled around this, and I think we get that you want to make sure that you're capturing and identifying those specific marketing and sales strategies that each of your identified competitors has, but you want to make sure that you're really intentional about that. And this means go look at the content that they have out there. What's the quality of it? How are they producing it? How are they distributing the content that they have? Can you build an understanding of what their sales funnel looks like? What channels they're using, how they're taking their message into market in general, and what are their pricing strategies? What can you say? And that's a really hard one, especially in B2B space. It's often really hard to get an understanding of your competitor's pricing strategy. You may not be able to get the exact dollar amounts, but it is actually pretty easy. Pretty easy isn't the right word, but pretty accessible to at least understand what their pricing model looks like, even if you don't have the exact competitive pricing. You don't need that as much, but understanding exactly how they sell and how their customers buy is because it gives you a lot of insight into where they may have some weaknesses that you can exploit, or they have some strengths that you may need to defend against. And finally, pulling it all together. We talked about 5 forces as part of the analysis, but when we're actually pulling it all together, I think there are a couple of foundational pieces that make it really easy to maintain your competitive landscape view. And one is the old SWOT. Create that strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats matrix for each one of these competitors that you defined, and go back on a regular basis and keep it updated. Make sure that you're actively thinking about each of these competitors based on this information that you've gathered. Especially really looking at what are your opportunities that you can exploit, what are the threats that you need to be aware of and be prepared to defend again, or cede territory too, because that can be a strategy. And one of the tools that I kept up to date a lot in most of my roles has been a competitive matrix, and it normally fits onto 1 or 2 PowerPoint slides, and I still keep them on slides simply because it's just so easy to manipulate and update and display to someone very quickly. But that competitive matrix that keeps you you identify what are the key, the most relevant dimensions for looking at this at my competitors. When I look at that SWOT that I've created, what are the dimensions that matter the most? Where do I need to be keeping tabs on everybody? Where is everyone differentiated? And for me, that competitive matrix is really focused on how each competitor is differentiated against the other in the marketplace. So you've got a quick reference which can help you quickly bring someone up to speed, analyze an opportunity, or create a create a new perspective that you can share based on a discussion that you're having. You can go back to it. You've got some evidence at your fingertips. But then also build the big summary. Build the big summary of everything you've learned and share it and educate others. That helps you own that perspective, the perspective itself, and emerge and get the credit you deserve as a leader in your organization that is actively thinking about what our overall market looks like and how our product fits into it. And that's the foundational step to going and building and refining and working on your product strategy, is having that shareable artifact that you can go back to, but that others can go to as well. The learning comes in the writing and the synthesis. And that's why creating that summary is so important. The act of creation is what brings it all together for you as an individual and gives you the strength that you need to have.
Jason, I think it's important.
Yes.
I think someone said this earlier, making sure that you as a company have defined how often you're also going to update that artifact. So whether you're doing that twice a year, once a year, but the information can become stale very quickly. And in order to stay agile with your roadmap, you've got to make sure that you're keeping that up to date.
Yep. Thanks for calling that back out. And folks, Stephen and everybody, if you go to productcoffee.com/treats, TREATS, you can download that. It's also linked at productcoffee.com/now. There's a downloads section on that page that has a link to this checklist. All right. And that brings us to the end of our session today. I hope this is a useful tool for everybody. I'd be really interested, by show of hands, just virtual hands. Look at your reactions panel down at the bottom of the screen, and I would be really interested to know if going deeper on competitive landscape analysis and doing a workshop to actually walk through this process and build out and frame and build out a competitive landscape, would that be a valuable resource for Product Coffee to offer to you? If that's something that you would absolutely want to participate in, throw up your virtual hand, and we'd love to take that feedback. So I see a few hands going up real quickly. Excellent. That is fantastic. Thank you all for sharing that. Would love to really appreciate that. So about over half of you look like you said you would be interested in that. So that's really great feedback. Thank you so much. All right. So next week, real quickly, I mentioned this on the call. Let me stop my sharing. There we go. And next week, we are going to have, there it is right there. We're going to have Dave Hawkey. He's VP of Product at Hearsay Systems out in Denver. And he's going to walk us through his guerrilla approach. And it's a little bit more, it's pretty refined at this point, to sizing a market in a really elegant way. Works very well, especially in a nascent market, in an emerging market that doesn't have a whole lot of industry support, where you need to do some original research to figure out what the bounds of this market actually are. Dave's got a great process that he's taught me and that I have relied on over many years. And I know that we used it a lot at IBM and in a lot of other, and Silverpop, and we keep going back to it in conversations in a little group that we have with a few folks that have worked together in the past. I think you'll really enjoy hearing this. We'll have registration online for the Art of Market Sizing later today, and look forward to seeing you all here next week. Andrew, yes, sir, Mr. Drew Gacy. Oh, yeah, we got hands up still for the. Is that hand up for the workshop, or did you have a question? Looks like it was for the workshop. Cool. All right. Well, thanks everybody. I hope you all have a great week. It was great to meet all the new folks here today. Once again, welcome to Kalu, Cassandra, Jeanette, and Audrey. And we will look forward to seeing you next time at Product Coffee as well. Have a great week, everybody.